You know what the most dangerous thing in America is, right? Nigga with a library card.
This is the Most Dangerous Thing in America podcast, a show in which we read books by black authors, and they're talked about by a black author, and you can listen if you are black or not black. That is okay. This week on the podcast, finishing up Hanif Abdurraqib's There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension, reading the third and fourth quarters with an intermission in between. If you didn't listen to part one, go back and listen to that. Disclaimer, not an audiobook. If you think it's an audiobook, go buy an audiobook. This is a discussion of the book. And then, with that being said, an addendum to part one, we said we would go back and see if you were more white, if you're from Michigan or not, as context. What I was saying is if you're more likely to be white. The context of this is, if I say a state name, do you assume a person's black or white? If I say, hey, I got a friend from Georgia, or Louisiana, right? You might assume the person is black. Say, oh, my buddy's from Michigan. I assume white. Same for Ohio. I assume white. Michigan, was curious because Detroit. But Cleveland is also very black, but not Detroit level black. But anyway, while looking at, you are more likely to be white if you are from Michigan. It's still majority white, so that's not a surprise. And same is true of Ohio. But those other states, Louisiana and Georgia, very black. Mississippi, very black. Those are the top three blackest states by percentage. Maryland is fourth. Alabama, fifth. Sixth is South Carolina. And seventh is the shocker. It's Delaware. And I cannot believe it. I can't believe it's Delaware. I guess Biden's corn pop story makes more sense now. Okay, so there you go. So that's all the homework from part one. Okay, on to the third quarter, which is subtitled "The Mercy of Exits: The Magic of Fruitless Pleading." So in this section, the basic overview, the basic through line. And so just to remind you, these quarter sections start out at 12 minutes. He has little subtitles that say minutes, and then he just counts down. And they go back and forth and here and there. But the essential idea here is that LeBron leaves and the Cavs become terrible. And that's really what's going on. And then we get a discussion of what it means for someone to leave and stuff. And that's where we get some of Abdurraqib's personal narrative woven in, as well as some larger pop examples, if you will. So let's first talk about this idea of wanting... I like the idea of paradox as a theme. Let's talk about the paradox of wanting somebody. So on page 173, Abdurraqib says, "There is sometimes a thinning of the portal between wanting someone gone and wanting them back." So this is the first great paradox he introduces in this second half. And it's very true. I'm sure we've all experienced it. And he goes on to talk about that, how he's left people and places and been on the receiving end of this paradox, or the given end of the paradox. So I thought that was great. And then that leads itself into a discussion about about two genres of song, the leaving song and the begging song. And he talks about Otis Redding's take of My Girl, as well as other songs. And I just like the section in general. I think it's one of the best in the book. Abdurraqib is very good when he talks about music. And I thought this was a great blend of, interests, basketball and music and love. Is love an interest? So there you go. And then on page 200, we have another paradox that I wanted to point out because it's going to come back up in the fourth quarter. Do you hear that? It's the pages of the book. We like that sound, right? So here he's talking about the idea of black people always getting blamed when the anger of injustice spills over into, oh my God, property destruction. And yeah, so here he says, the fire says, get gone and we can start clean. And so, then, what isn't your own can become your own. If it is all some vast and empty burned down nothing at the end of a long night, and I know this isn't generous to the shop owners and the elders who have lived on a block for decades and wanted to die on a block that was at least close to how they remembered it, but what can I do to convince you that fire is not the villain, and the person who lights a match isn't a villain, and the people cheering while a building burns aren't the villains, and there are villains, but they aren't here? A paradox. And the elders line shows that it's a paradox, because the elders and the shop owners, and presumably from the community, they've done nothing wrong, but they're being punished. And the people who are punishing them aren't doing it, aren't attempting to do it directly, and aren't doing it because of them. And so we can't call them villains, but certainly the elders and shop owners want to. And so it creates a paradox, and an interesting one. And it's going to loop back around in the fourth quarter. So we'll leave it here for now, and we'll get back to it in the fourth quarter. And we'll go instead to the Cavs being terrible. The natural state of the Cleveland Cavaliers is for them to be terrible. And when they were terrible during the intermission in which LeBron was gone, Abdurraqib enjoyed watching them. And one of his favorite guys to watch was Boobie Gibson. And he talks about nicknames and the old Cleveland Cavaliers back in the 70s? Anyway, and all their funny nicknames. And what I like about this section is I agree that it is fun to watch bad teams. I just like watching basketball. Would I go to a high school basketball game without what is the worst level of basketball I'll watch? I'll walk through a park and watch a basketball game. I would go to a high school basketball game, but wouldn't go out of my way to. But I've tried to go to G League games with family and friends, and people usually turn me down. I don't care. I'll go watch a game. So just a couple weeks ago, went to an Angels game. And I think there's something to be instead of the Dodgers. And it costs $7 to get in the door, whereas the Dodgers game is $45. I think there's something really nice about, a very cheap ticket, watching a bad team. Kind of feels more intimate, and also less stakes, and the game really just becomes a game. You're not there if you were a Celtics fan this year and they won 65 games, I'm sure it was enjoyable when they finally won the championship. But the whole year, anytime they lost any game, you only lose 17 games, each loss is oh my God, well, something wrong with Tatum. Well, this team can't close. Now they don't really have it. And each loss in the playoffs, well, looks like they're just god-awful. Oh, they're faking it again. So your 65-win team isn't even fun. Meanwhile, if you're a fan of, whatever, the Raptors were terrible this year, or the Hawks. People have pseudo expectations for the Hawks. Whatever, just pick your team out of the hat. You just have some horrible team. It's kind of fun to watch them. When I was a kid, living in Cali, Bill Walton, Ralph Lawler on the call, Pooh Richardson, Lloyd Vaught, Eric Piakowski. Eventually we got the Candyman, Olwa Candy. Those were good times. Zero stakes. You could watch those games. You knew they weren't going to win, or if they did, it was a bonus. And then you could go to the game. It didn't cost anything. Never mind the Donald Sterling aspect of it all. I'm just saying, there's a certain part where if a team's bad, it's also still fun to go and watch them. The lovable losers like the Cubs. So I thought Abdurraqib was onto something there. And I, for one, appreciate a bad basketball team. Okay, so after the third quarter, we have an intermission in which we discuss White Men Can't Jump, which is not a good film, and we'll just leave it at that, but I believe Abdurraqib more or less agrees. But the interesting part of it is not that it's a good or a bad film, but just about what it leads the conversation to, which is about white people in black spaces. And yes, the NBA is a black space. The All-Star Game is known colloquially as the Black Super Bowl. So, it's a black space. Abdurraqib talks about the idea that, let me get to the page here, that there's a thirst for a good white American basketball player. And I don't disagree with him, but I do have some clarifying statements. He says, This is the part of the movie that turns on a familiar axis, whether or not it is openly admitted. It appears often that there is a hunger for a white, American-born basketball star in the NBA among the media, among some basketball fans, and I don't just mean a good player, I mean a great player. It is the great white hope syndrome baked so firmly into the DNA of American culture that there are people unaware of when they're bowing to it. When a white player emerges who might fit this mold, words like swagger start getting bandied about. It's very true. He's not wrong. Me and my friend once upon a time had an argument about Adam Morrison. That was about 20 years ago. And I didn't think he was any good, and he didn't turn out to be any good. And there is, good examples of where that's been a thing, right? Okay. There's also examples of like Isaiah Thomas talking about Larry Bird and going way too far. One would even say saying things that are absolutely insane. So, there's many sides to the coin. So there is and then another side is like during the 90s, there was a whole conversation about how white folks didn't want to fork over money to watch hip hop generation black guys with baggy shorts run up and down the court and scream, things like that. So and that's why you would want a white star who presumably won't do those things. Except, they totally will. And also, who cares? But here's my point, which is separate from Abdurraqib's point, which is valid and encompasses all those things I just said. I want there to be a good white player too. And I want there to be a good white player for a very simple reason. We are falling behind in the only thing that I care about patriotically. And that is basketball. I don't really care, right? Like gold medals. Yeah. But it is something we're supposed to be good at. It's the only global sport that we're good at. The NFL doesn't count. You can call baseball a global sport, I suppose. Basketball is our one good global sport. And we're the best at it. And have been for a while. But we're losing our grip. And part of the reason why, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, we have 14% of the population doing all the work. That doesn't add up. It's no good. The math is no good. So what we need is for all the white kids and everybody else, all the Mexican kids, all the Asian kids, all the Hispanic kids, everybody from all over America, this is my Martin Luther King speech, from every race and creed and religion to put down the soccer ball, which is the most popular youth sport in America, and pick up the basketball and go out there and win one for your country in the only way that matters. Everything else about patriotism is dumb, but basketball is good. Go win a basketball game. We're not going to be good at soccer. That's past. It's over. Okay? We're not going to get there. It's not American enough of a sport to work. It's going to take too long. So the only global sport we can have a chance at being the best at is the one we're already the best at. And we can't keep doing it with 14% of the population, right? So I understand the concern. I don't want Cooper Flagg to be great because I want white people to feel unthreatened about the NBA. That's not my concern. I want Cooper Flagg to be great so that he inspires other hoopers. I want another Jerry West from West Virginia. I want another Cooper Flagg from Maine. Now, these states, I'm assuming, are very white. Actually, I have the stats up right now. Let me check. How white? I'm just going to scroll to the bottom. I bet West Virginia's there. West Virginia is 5% black, 4.8% black. Maine is 1.99%. These are exactly the states we need. Wyoming, Vermont, Utah, Idaho, New Hampshire, South Dakota. Go get it done. We're counting on you. The future of American basketball is in your hands. Okay, it's a little bit outside of what Abdurraqib was talking about, but nevertheless. All right, then we move on to the fourth quarter, and this is where we come back to the paradox. So the name of the fourth quarter is City as its False Self. And I think the point here is that Cleveland wins a championship, right? LeBron James leaves, he comes back. there's that tug and, what do you call it? Tug and pull? That seems wrong. Push and pull of, do we want him back? Yeah, we want him back. We want to win, but do we want to win? Okay, he's back. He's back. We win. We're united. And Abdurraqib talks about this commercial that came on when LeBron was going back, and it was all about being united as a city. And all of this stuff and all of these feelings and all of these ways we're supposed to feel about what the city is. City of champions, soon to be champions and eventual champions, united champions, people together behind a cause. And this is when Abdurraqib calls bullshit, right? And that's what the fourth quarter is about. We are not what we are making ourselves out to be. We are actually what we have always been. But so that's a paradox, right? But then another paradox occurs on page 271, and loop back to the third quarter in your mind if you can, and try to think of it as I read this. We'll light some shit on fire and march in these streets, but it's always in the name of some other niggas. Not anyone here who the cops done rolled up on and left bleeding in the street. Yeah, we could take this motherfucker apart brick by brick, but then we'd have more bricks than hands willing to rebuild anything. And ain't that the way of it? We don't know what we do with ourselves if we won here. And here we go again with the paradox. To loop it back in with the third quarter, we're talking about the idea of there being no villain, right? That's a paradox, right? Because there is a villain, but the villain's not here. Who do we blame with this rage? And then here we go back to the fourth quarter where we've burned down the thing. We've gotten angry. We've set the stage to burn it down, to rebuild it in the image that we want. But we don't even know whether or not to rebuild it. And one of the things about this that I think is interesting is there's obviously the race question, just like with the white man can't jump thing, right? There's obviously the racial aspect of this, right? We're burning this down to rebuild in our own image. He's talking about his hood and where he comes from. And he's talking about, presumably, mostly black folks. But just in general, if you're an American who's pissed off about the injustices, the idea of really ripping everything apart and then building it back up, do we have the energy? We have the rage, we have the anger, we're all outraged and upset, we're all screaming out of our windows, we're not going to take it anymore. But do we have the inspiration to rebuild? And part of that's not even a knock on people, If you walk down the street in your town or your city, you're going to notice buildings that are just old. I live in an older building. Sometimes you live in an apartment that's old and you go like, why don't they build a new fucking apartment? And then you see a development downtown and how long it's been in development. And part of it is America and construction costs and all of these different things. But another part of it is just fucking hard, man. It's hard to make stuff. It's a miracle that any of this stuff works. The sewer lines and the electricity lines and this thing and that thing and that thing and that thing and the red tape and the bureaucracy, but also just things working. Just simply, how do things work? And then they work and then they get installed on a mass scale. It's just difficult. It's just difficult. We see how difficult it is to maintain infrastructure, how difficult it is to update infrastructure, how difficult it is to convince people of updating infrastructure. So I know that seems like it's besides the point, but it isn't. Because you can be angry as shit and you can go burn something and get angry and light it on fire. But then when you're sitting there with more bricks than you know what to do with, somebody's got to build it back up. And it's difficult. It's just difficult. It has nothing to do with ability or whatever. It's just hard to make something. And at the end of the day, we've made this place for better or worse. And sometimes you just look around and go, shit, all right. But that's not really what Abdurraqib wants. His point is we want to imagine the better place. So if we do win, if we do manage to burn it down and have the right to build it back up and reclaim it as our own, it's going to be better for the future generations. So I thought that was nice. And so from there, we loop back around and Abdurraqib talks about what it means for a city's mask to drop, right? After the unity is gone and all of that. And he does this within the context of the shootings of, young black youth, mostly men. Talks about the one in Columbus. He talks about Cleveland. He talks about Tamir Rice. He talks about the idea of what a child is and who decides it. He talks about the idea of people invading spaces where they're not supposed to be. That's another through line, obviously, is the hood and who it belongs to. And what happens when people who aren't from there invade it and say, oh, it's a war zone. Oh, that's dangerous. They get the police called. The police show up and they do something that they shouldn't do. So he talks about all of that, and that's how the fourth quarter ends. And we have that heavy question hanging over us of whether or not this is all America really is. Is the true face of America this death? Is the true face of America this inchoate rage? Is there more to this place? Right? So, yeah. It's a powerful ending to the book. Good ending. And in general, those themes that we've talked about, ascension and Ohio and paradoxes and love, if that's, longing and leaving and wanting back, all good themes. If I have one complaint about the book, it would be the basketball. I guess part of it is anticipation. I assumed the book was going to be more focused on basketball. And part of it is levity. The kind of serious writing I like about basketball usually doesn't dovetail around the idea of what's wrong with America or the shootings of black youth. But here it does, and I'm not going to blame it for that. I just didn't know it was going there, and it went there. But just separating that out, I guess I didn't think that the book incorporated basketball all that much. Now, that's kind of bullshit, because it definitely talks about basketball quite a bit. But I don't know. I feel like you could almost swap that cover out, swap out the name, call it There's Always This Year, Ohio and Ascension. And on the cover have a picture of a cartoon stock character in an airplane. And that would have been just as fitting. And then the basketball would have just been there in the backdrop. But maybe I'm wrong. And I certainly think I was colored by my anticipation. I went into this thinking that I was going to get a relatively light-hearted book about basketball. And instead I got a very serious book about what it means to be black in America, what it means to be American, what it means for a city to win, what it means for a city to be true to itself, what we see when we look in the mirror, when we peel back our false faces. I got all of that. I thought I was getting some talks about basketball. Some, Shea Serrano-esque. Shea Serrano-esque? I like Shea Serrano. Some Shea Serrano-esque essays about basketball. Some Klosterman essays about basketball. Something like that. But instead, this is a meditation. And it's a melange of Abdurraqib at the end of the day. So I do think it's a solid book. I would say as a caveat, go in knowing that you're going to get all pieces of Abdurraqib. This isn't a basketball book. So that's I do think it's fair to say this is not a basketball book. It is a book about Abdurraqib, Hanif Abdurraqib. It is a book about the many different things that he's passionate about. And it's a melange of his passions. And basketball might be somewhat at the forefront a little bit, kind of maybe. But I don't even think it's really the dominant storyline. It's kind of just like a thing that helps tug things along. It's how the book is structured, but it's not really what the book is about at all. Much more about ascension of the author, of a place, of a people, of LeBron James, etc. Much more about ascension than it is about basketball. So, okay. I believe that's going to do it, folks. In 2 weeks, we are going to be reading, so July 11th, we're going to be podcasting about Donovan X. Ramsey's When Crack Was King. And then 2 weeks from then, we will do the second half of it. And that book, I think, is more straightforward nonfiction. I wasn't aware that this one, Hanif Abdurraqib's book, was more of a memoir. So that one, more straight up nonfiction. So definitely will require 2 podcasts. But yeah, that's the schedule. If you want to read along, July 11th, July 25th, When Crack Was King. In the meantime, you could go to Spotify, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called, Pocket Cast, YouTube. You could subscribe, you could like, you could recommend the show. The music here is by TheKeepRunning. You can certainly check him out on SoundCloud. That's in the show notes, as is my website where I do writings and other things. So if you want to check me out, that's there. And yeah, that's gonna do it. So until next time, stay safe, stay black, and keep reading.
This time enough at last. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair.